In the late 1870s, an academic called Francis Galton got interested in the phenomenon of mental imagery. The fact that we can obviously see things very clearly in our visual field with our eyes, assuming we don't have some kind of medical vision deficiency, but that we can also imagine visual imagery in our minds, albeit probably less vividly and at a lower resolution than we can actually see it. So Galton thought, novelists and artists are always talking about this, seeing something in their mind's eye or visually imagining something, and yet the problem didn't seem to have been studied scientifically yet. So he thought, what's a way that I can approach this scientifically? So the method he came up with was initially to devise a series of questions about the intensity of people's mental imagery. And he thought that he would go around asking people these questions in some way. I'm not sure exactly whether he was going to send the survey around or something like that, and see if people differed in their experience of visual imagery. If I tell you to picture an apple, or I think the example he used was a dining table, a breakfast table, how colourful is it? Is it intensely colourful like real visual imagery, or is it kind of less colourful, more grey or with indistinct colour? Does it have visual details? How high resolution is it compared to your actual vision? Is it just hazy and murky and you can't really describe it very well, or is it as clear as day, as if you're actually seeing it? In my own experience, my visual imagery tends to be a lot lower resolution, a lot murkier, a lot darker than my actual vision. If I imagine an apple, I can kind of imagine details if I put my mind to it. I can imagine a dent on the surface of the apple. I can imagine what colour the apple is. And I do certainly have a visual-like image of an apple in my brain. But it's absolutely nowhere near as clear as if I was really seeing it. I could never imagine an apple and project it into my actual visual field as if I was really seeing it right there. I gather that some people have much more vivid mental imagery, and some people have less vivid mental imagery. So this was what Galton was trying to discover. How much variance is there, between different people's ability to visualize things? So quite sensibly, he decided to send his questions around to other scientists that he knew to get their perspective on the questions maybe, and to see if they'd thought much about this themselves introspectively. As they were scientists, there was a better chance that they'd have some kind of scientific insight into what was going on psychologically or neurologically. So he sent the questions around to his scientist friends, and he got a surprising set of responses. It seems as though more than one of his friends responded with something like, "What do you want about? Mental imagery is just a metaphor. When people talk about visualizing things in their mind's eye, they're not really talking about projecting visual imagery into their minds. They're just, recalling details about the scene. They're not actually seeing it. They're not having a visual-like experience." The scientist that he wrote to seemed surprised that Galton had misinterpreted the metaphor of mental imagery. They seemed surprised that he thought that people could actually visualize things in that way. They considered it to be a fantasy. Being able to actually imagine something that's not there it's not something humans are capable of doing. How would that work? How would it even feel? How would that be different from hallucinating? These questions presuppose assent to some sort of a proposition regarding the mind's eye and the images which it sees. This points to some initial fallacy. It's only by a figure of speech that I can describe my recollection of a scene as a mental image which I can see with my mind's eye. I do not see it, any more than a man sees the 1,000 lines of Sophocles which under due pressure he's ready to repeat. The memory possesses it. By the time Galton published his paper in 1880, he'd worked out what was going on. Clearly, the scientists that he'd consulted had some kind of relatively unusual condition which meant that they couldn't mentally visualize things. When he approached the general population, of course, as I think nobody will be surprised by, they all knew exactly what he meant. Of course I can mentally visualize things, that's just part of the experience of being human. But the scientists, on the other hand, had clearly never been able to mentally visualize things, and while they heard references to the mind's eye or mental imagery as they were growing up, they must have just imagined that this was some kind of metaphor. The scientists could presumably recall visual details, or they could recall details of scenes which had originally come in through the visual system, but they recalled these as abstract semantic details rather than actually projecting them as an image in their mind's eye. They remembered that there was a chair in that corner of the room and a table in that corner of the room, but they couldn't see these things unless they were physically in the room looking at them. Nowadays we have a better understanding of this condition, and we call it aphantasia. Indeed, it seems that it affects a relatively small, although not absolutely tiny, proportion of the population. There's still a way to go with understanding exactly how mental imagery works neurologically, but suffice it to say, we now understand quite well that most people can mentally visualize things, some people can't do it at all, and among those people who can do it, there's a lot of variance in the intensity of the mental imagery. I think Radiolab recently did a very interesting podcast installment on this, which I direct people to. But yeah, I think this points to a very interesting case of a small group of scientists taking their own experience of the human condition and assuming that it was true of everybody. In a previous video about a year ago, I mentioned that I don't have an internal monologue, as probably most people do. I was aware by this point that there were a few kind of pop articles on the internet about people who lacked internal monologues, but that the phenomenon isn't very well described scientifically. In fact, if you look up no inner speech or no internal monologue in Google Scholar, there are really barely any studies that seem to cover it. So there's a lot of scope for people not believing that this is possible. And indeed, in the comments of my video where I mentioned it, there were a small number of comments where people were just incredulous, or sometimes fairly emphatic about their idea that you couldn't think without an internal monologue. There'd be no way of thinking. What would thinking even look like without inner speech? And I think this is yet another one of these cases where two people can have different experiences of being a person, and they may absolutely not be able to see each other's perspectives at all. The comments on my video weren't the only ones I'd ever read that were incredulous at the idea of people not having internal monologues. I've even had university lectures from guest lecturers, not from actual people within the university, who very heavily implied that they thought people were lying when they claimed not to have internal monologues. And this, obviously, one's initial reaction to something like that is frustration and anger. And then you go away and you start to think, if everybody says that it's impossible not to have an internal monologue, is it possible that maybe I do have an internal monologue and I'm not recognizing it as such? Maybe I do have one, but for some reason I'm just not finding it in my head. Maybe I'm not noticing it. And I asked myself some of the questions that I'd come across on Reddit in my late teens, which led me to question the presence of an internal monologue in the first place. And they were questions like, what's the voice of your internal monologue? Because sometimes I think in my own voice and sometimes it sounds like Vin Diesel. Or what language do you think in? If you're a German speaker and you've lived in England for years, do you start thinking in English rather than German? And to me, none of these questions made any sense at all. There's no honest answer to whose voice my internal monologue is in, because it doesn't have a voice. That's an acoustic property, an auditory property, that it doesn't make sense to ascribe to my internal monologue. It would be just as ridiculous to ask me, what does my internal monologue smell like? What does such and such a thought taste like? It doesn't make sense. If I wanted to answer that question, I'd have to just make up an answer out of nowhere. So I was quite satisfied after that I actually don't have an internal monologue. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've realised that I talk out loud to myself an enormous amount. I probably say out loud quite a lot of what most people have in their internal monologues. So if there is some, if there is some principle that humans have to have their thoughts filtered through some kind of verbal medium, then at least you could say that my thoughts conform to that pattern. It's just that the internal monologue is external rather than internal. One of the comments on my consciousness video about a year ago was something to the effect of, if you don't have an internal monologue, then does that mean that when you want to go and buy some milk, you realise you have no milk in the fridge, you don't hear a voice inside your head saying, oh no, there's no milk in the fridge, I have to go and get some? Then in that case, how do you know that you need to go and get milk? And to me, this is, when I first read this comment, I found it very surprising that the person thinks about it that way. Obviously, the brain must have some kind of cognitive process underlying the internal monologue, I have to go and get milk. So why does this person not realise that there doesn't need to be that middleman? The cognitive process can just straight away lead to you going to get the milk. For me, that's how it is. I don't say out loud, oh bugger, I don't have any milk, and I don't think that verbally in my head. I just go out and get the milk. But this sort of prompted me to think, well, what is my experience of intending to go and get some milk from the shop? It's not visual. I don't imagine myself going to the shop to get milk. As I said, it's not verbal. And I came to realise that I don't know whether I actually am conscious of the intention to go to the shop and get some milk. I'm clearly conscious of the whole sensory experience of getting in the car and turning the car on and driving and picking up the milk and all of those things visually and so on. But I don't know if I can find any conscious property, any property of my conscious experience that corresponds to intending to go and get the milk. Now you might say, well, that's insane, because that suggests that you just walk out of the door with no idea where you're going, get in the car with no idea where you're going, drive the car to the shop with no conscious idea of where you're going. And yeah, I it's hard to think about this completely introspectively, but I kind of think that's actually what I do. Most of my thinking goes on more or less inside a black box, unless I externally verbalize it. I used the black box analogy in the last video I did about internal monologues as well. I said, I don't know what I'm going to say before it actually comes out of my mouth and then I hear it. I don't have, there's almost a black box in my head that generates the speech, and then I say it. And I'm not the only one who has this experience. Plenty of people said as much in the comments, and I think there's a recording of Noam Chomsky saying the exact same thing.
What's conscious, let's say conscious decisions and so on, are deeply intermingled with unconscious mental acts, so closely intermingled with them that I don't think you can extract the conscious part and have a coherent picture. I'm making a decision to produce a particular sentence, but I have no awareness of when I decided to make that decision. It just happened. I don't even know what sentence I'm producing till I hear it.
But we certainly don't most of the time experience surprise at what we say. We're not interested that, oh, I said that. I wonder why I said that, except in very rare cases. So to some extent, the brain must kind of smooth over the fact that we don't consciously know what we're going to say, or don't consciously know what we're going to do before we say it or before we do it. Now, I'll stop right here and say that it would be hypocritical of me not to acknowledge that some people in the comments of my last video said that they didn't experience this black box phenomenon, and that they did feel very strongly that they knew what they were going to say before it came out. So I want to acknowledge those people and say that I'm only talking about the subsection of people who do feel the black box phenomenon. But I feel the same thing around going to get some milk. I'm not conscious of the cognitive process that drives me to go and do it. But I also don't feel alarmed by the fact that I'm leaving the house, and I don't feel alarmed by the fact I'm getting in the car. As the now sadly late Daniel Dennett would have pointed out, and in fact did point out at length in his book Consciousness Explained, the brain is capable of playing quite a lot of tricks on itself, pulling quite a lot of sleight of hand, or sleight of hand, I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce that word, to smooth over the inconsistencies, or what would otherwise be the inconsistencies in our conscious experience. So one example that's often used, and that Dennett uses himself, is that within your visual field, for the most part, you probably feel, unless you have a visual deficiency, you probably feel that you have a really very high definition view of basically everything that's even remotely in front of you. You feel that you can see that just as clearly as you can see that, or that, or that. Obviously, you realise you're paying attention to the thing in the middle, but, you know, you still have a high definition view of all the other things. And yet, if you pick up a playing card face down, you hold it up here in your peripheral vision, and then you slowly turn it around, you probably couldn't even accurately report whether it was a red card or a black card, let alone what the actual number of card was. And that's because our peripheral vision is extremely low resolution compared to what we think it is. The brain smooths over the poor resolution of our peripheral vision, and it's not really functionally important, because if I want to know what the card is in practical terms, I can just look at it and then I will know, because it will be in the middle of my vision. There's no real practical deficiency here, because you can just look wherever you want if you have fully functioning eyes. The poor resolution of peripheral vision doesn't matter, practically speaking. And so the brain glosses it over, and it makes us imagine that we can see all this stuff around the edges really sharply. Now, I am not a visual neuroscientist, and so I don't know whether the brain actually interpolates a load of information, whether it reconstructs what the things in our peripheral vision must look like. I know what that mirror looks like, and so maybe my brain's just putting a CGI mirror there. Or if we actually don't have that interpolation, and the brain is just straightforwardly telling us that we can see what's in our peripheral vision even though we can't. But either way, this is a very good example of an illusion that the brain plays on itself. And I would say that the same thing is probably true when I intend to go out and buy some milk. I go out and do it, and all the while my brain is perhaps, to talk very abstractly, blocking, or because the activity in my brain, the cognition that's going on in my brain, is all consistent and fine and unproblematic, I'm just going to get some milk, it doesn't create any kind of alarm at the fact that I'm not conscious that I'm going to get the milk. And so I don't experience any conscious confusion about it. After all, if I did go delving around into my thoughts and tried to pull something into my consciousness, or say it, or mentally visualize it, I would easily be able to. And so, there's no reason to be alarmed. But if I don't pull it into my consciousness deliberately, if I don't deliberately verbalize it or mentally visualize it, I'm actually not conscious that I intend to go and get some milk until after I've had the sensory experience of doing it. My thinking about consciousness over the last few months has been dominated by the idea of coupling and decoupling. The idea that certain phenomenological experiences might be tied together or might become disassociated from each other, and what that actually means for consciousness. So, for example, the sensation of pain, the physical sensation of pain, may become decoupled from the negative valence that it carries. If you walk into a table leg and you stub your toe, this may be intensely painful. There may be a sharp pain sensation that feels like it's coming from your foot. and you might have a physical reaction, you might yell ow, you might swear. And also there's this idea, this valence to it, the fact that it's bad rather than good. But through things like meditation or taking psychoactive drugs and other kinds of things that alter the mind, people can get to a point where they can feel pain fully. It's not numbed, they're not ignoring it, they're not avoiding thinking about it. They feel the physical sensation, but it becomes decoupled from the negative valence. So although they feel the physical sensation, it doesn't feel like it's a bad thing. For many people, this is difficult to imagine. Your mind may immediately jump to the pain being numbed because the physical feeling of the pain is intrinsically coupled with negative valence. Feeling pain is inherently bad. There's no way of separating those two characteristics from each other. But clearly there is for certain people in certain situations. Is it that the two characteristics were always separate and had only ever been experienced in tandem with each other? Or is it that they were actually the same phenomenological property until such a time as somebody meditated hard enough or took psychedelic drugs, and then they became genuinely phenomenologically separate from each other? I think another example of this is taste modalities or flavor modalities, or whatever I don't know exactly how those words differ from each other technically, but the idea that taste or flavor is composed of a small number of different components which can be combined with each other in different ways. So the idea that we have the sweet, the savoury, the sour, whatever else. For me, I could never differentiate these things very well in a lot of cases. I knew very well what sweet felt like, and I could identify sweet things, but the rest of them were, tricky, especially sour and bitter. I couldn't work out whether something was composed of a sour flavour with a bit of this added and a bit of that added. Each flavour felt very much like just a different flavour altogether. So when I was told by some friends that when you're cooking you should add a little bit of sour and a little bit of sweet and a little bit of, to balance everything out, I had to Google what things are sour, because I knew basically as a rote fact that lemons and limes are sour, but that's pretty much it. When I read that certain yogurts are sour, I was surprised because I couldn't think of any flavour component in common between yogurt and lemons. So I talked to my friends about this and they said, well, that's surprising because humans should be able to differentiate these categories from each other. And so I wonder whether if I got more into food, I would learn to differentiate them, and I'd start feeling them as distinct things whenever I ate a piece of food. Am I actually experiencing a kind of reduced set of qualia compared to somebody who can differentiate these different tastes or flavours? Or is it that I'm experiencing all the same qualia as them and I just don't know I am because I can't tell the difference? This issue of coupling goes very deep, has lots of layers, and I think it can be used to illustrate some of the big issues with how we try to diagnose consciousness in things that aren't human. So the most powerful way of working out whether certain things have consciousness or not would be to develop some kind of predictive model, work out what the correlates of consciousness are, what things correlate with consciousness. And then if we have such a model, if we have a very powerful model like that, we can point to something random like a mug, which we can't tell immediately whether it's conscious or not. And we could say, well, it has these characteristics and it doesn't have these characteristics, so on balance it's probably not conscious. The model allows us to diagnose consciousness in things which we don't have direct introspective access to. The complicated thing here, well, it's not, I don't think it's complicated at all, but the problematic thing here is that the only things that we have subjective access to are ourselves. So we only have one data point, in effect, of a type of thing that can be conscious, which we're certain can be conscious, whatever we mean by consciousness. So that data point is that consciousness can be correlated with a human body in the solar system. Why bring the solar system into it? Well, if you look at all of the things that we can be certain are conscious through introspective, awareness of the consciousness, they are all humans in the solar system. So there's a very, very strong statistical relationship there. Well, hang on, Simon, that's a load of nonsense, because the only reason the solar system comes into it is because all humans are in the solar system. There aren't any humans outside of the solar system. That doesn't mean that the solar system is a meaningful predictor of consciousness. It doesn't mean the solar system has anything to do with consciousness. Well, you're right. I'm going to use that idea to sort of hone in on things. So let's zoom into the human body. Can we say that the human body is the one thing that we're certain can correlate with consciousness? Well, that seems to be a bit too broad as well, because when I look into my consciousness introspectively, I don't think that any of it is from the perspective of my skin. I don't think that any of it is from the perspective of my muscles. More to the point, I think that if you replaced my skin and muscles with some kind of mechanism, some human-made mechanism that does the job of skin and muscles but isn't the same as human skin and muscles, it doesn't seem intuitive to me that my consciousness would change or stop. So these things, as far as we can work out, need not be necessary prerequisites to consciousness. Okay, well, what about my heart? Well, again, if you replaced my heart with some kind of metal box that does the same job as a heart, I don't see why my consciousness should significantly change or stop. Okay, well, maybe we can say that the human central nervous system is the one thing that we're certain can be correlated with consciousness. Even that seems a little bit broad. There are a lot of aspects of the central nervous system that don't seem to pop up as separate elements of our subjective experience. So we know that glial cells, a certain type of cell, plays a very important role in the central nervous system in maintenance and things like that. We don't know the full range of things that they do, but we can be fairly confident that the central nervous system wouldn't work without them. And yet when I introspect into my consciousness, I can't see the glial cells anywhere. There's no aspect of my subjective experience that seems to be directly correlated with the presence of the glial cells. And so, as far as we know at the moment, we could replace the glial cells with something else that did the same job, and perhaps consciousness would still carry on. We have no reason to think otherwise. The same is true of other aspects of the central nervous system. The myelin sheath that coats the axons of neurons. This is vital for the proper function of the central nervous system, but I can't see it in my consciousness. I can't tell that there are myelin sheaths in my central nervous system just from looking within. So you can get narrower and narrower and narrower, and you eventually find that the thing which actually correlates with our conscious subjective experience, at least this is what I find, is the information processing happening within my neurons, within my central nervous system, within my brain, within my body, within my, within the solar system. So all of these things, the solar system, the body, the central nervous system, the brain, all of these things could be said to be extraneous to the issue of consciousness. The only thing that we know is correlated with consciousness is certain examples of information processing. And because we only have access to human consciousness, because humans are the only things that we can communicate with, we can't communicate with plants and ask them if they're conscious, we're left with an extremely impoverished sample here. So for all we know, maybe you do need a heart to be conscious. Maybe you do need a central nervous system with myelin sheaths and glial cells to be conscious. This could turn out to be true. But on the other hand, maybe you just need information processing. And information processing is an extremely nebulous concept. You could lump almost any process in and call it information processing. Me hitting the wall and the wall making a sound is information processing if you look at it the right way. Fundamentally, all of these things are just, physical things knocking into each other and causing knock-on effects. That's what the central nervous system is doing, and that's what everything's doing all the time. So, for all we know, the electrochemical reactions in a plant could produce or be correlated with consciousness. All of these things could be conscious. And it seems ridiculous to say that. It seems deeply unintuitive. And many philosophers and scientists will dismiss it as nonsense just because it seems deeply unintuitive. But if you actually think about it, I think it makes an enormous amount of sense. When you remove all of the extraneous stuff, all that we know consciousness is really correlated with is information processing. That's how I see it anyway. There are two broad classes of response that I feel the need to anticipate here. The first one is, well, okay, I know what you mean by consciousness, and I know what you mean about consciousness seeming like a very different thing to just electrical processes in the brain, and I understand why the hard problem of consciousness is so hard, but, with my own introspections about what my consciousness feels like, I just can't imagine how a plant would have anything like that. I can't imagine what it would be like for the plant. My consciousness is dominated by this intensely detailed visual field, but the plant doesn't have an image-forming retina, so it can't possibly be conscious of a visual field in the same way that I am. Well, obviously that on its own isn't a good argument, because plenty of people are congenitally blind, and presumably they're still conscious even though they don't have a visual field. But, they still have other senses like hearing, and they're aware of the passage of time, and what things happened later and what things happened earlier, and what kinds of things would a plant be aware of based on what we know about its electrochemical nervous system? Well, one thing I've said it would be aware of is being snipped. If you cut off a plant's limb, it might have the capacity to have some kind of spatial awareness of which of its limbs had been cut. It would be able to feel maybe the intensity of the electrochemical response to the cut. I don't know if that corresponds to how quick the cut was, or how blunt it was, or whatever. But those are things that seem to be modulated by its nervous system, so those are things that it might have some kind of conscious experience of. But, I can't imagine how it would have a conscious experience of those things that wasn't embedded in a more human-like conscious experience of the world. And obviously it doesn't have a human-like conscious experience of the world because it doesn't have all of the sensory systems that humans have. So I just can't imagine it, basically. And what I would say to that is I would hark back to my earlier comments about thinking without an internal monologue. Many of us think without an internal monologue, and if you don't believe me, then look to the much more well-documented phenomena of aphantasia and anoralia. Often people who can't form mental imagery also can't hear things in their mind, so presumably those people don't have an internal monologue and they can still think. So, some people find it unbelievable that you could think without a verbal internal monologue, and clearly people can. I mean, think about something like a magpie. Magpies don't have language as far as we can work out, and yet they clearly have intentions. They clearly intend to do something. They deceive each other. They're very socially intelligent, but they can't have an internal monologue going on in some language in their brain. So clearly cognition is possible without some language overlay. But that's very difficult to imagine for a lot of people. So I would say that it's the same difficulty of imagination, the same lack of imagination that leads to someone being unable to imagine what it's like to be a conscious plant. I can't imagine what it would be like to be a conscious plant. In fact, I struggle to imagine what it would be like to be a bat, because its sensory systems are so differently organised to mine. But, I know that different organisms think and experience things differently, because clearly different humans do. So I don't think that my lack of ability to imagine is, on its own, a good argument about plants' capacity for consciousness. The other type of criticism I'm expecting is quite common in debates around consciousness, and that is along the lines of, but Simon, it seems as though you're trying to define the word consciousness deliberately so science can't get to it. If you just allowed consciousness to mean neural integration, or you allowed consciousness to mean human wakefulness, or you allowed consciousness to mean sub-vocalization, or something that we can measure, then there wouldn't be a hard problem at all. But you seem to be deliberately trying to make the definition of consciousness something which is inaccessible to science. You seem to be trying to put inaccessibility into the definition. Why would you do that? It's a really confusing way of arguing about something. It seems as though you're trying to invent this property that doesn't actually exist, and then argue about whether it exists or not. What's the point? This is really bad argumentation. Now, this kind of criticism, as I say, is fairly common in arguments about consciousness, and I think even Daniel Dennett, the illusionist himself, the man who thinks that consciousness is fully just an illusion, acknowledged the existence of these criticisms, and it seems as though he wasn't a fan of them. I think at some point in Consciousness Explained, he says something like, I don't want to be one of those scientists or philosophers who blatantly denies the existence of things that they must know full well are real. I think this is a real, almost an axiomatic difference between people who like to think about consciousness and people who think it's all a load of nonsense. The idea that if it's scientifically inaccessible, why would you even think about it? Why would you try to why would you try to generate some kind of scientific explanation for it? For a long time, I found this perspective extremely hard to understand. I can understand looking at the problem and thinking, that seems so scientifically untouchable that there's no point even bothering at this stage trying to answer it. And I could respect that opinion. I don't think that I could ever take that stance myself, because I think it's such an interesting question, it demands an answer. But I could, I think that's a coherent perspective to take. The hard problem of consciousness is so hard that I'm just going to focus on things we can resolve. But I don't think that's the perspective of these people. Their perspective seems to be more one of confusion, of you're just chatting a load of nonsense about something that clearly doesn't exist, and I don't know why you're doing that. For a long time, I just took this to be people sticking a bit too rigidly to a physicalist, materialist worldview. Obviously knowing that consciousness and qualia were real, because we all know that they're real, but saying that because they're not externally objectively verifiable, therefore, I'm going to stick so rigidly to my materialist perspective that I'm going to say that they're not real, brackets, even though they obviously are. But I've come to maybe a different understanding of this now. I've thought about the extent to which our experiences of thinking can be different. One person can visualize things, one person can't, one person has an internal monologue, the other, another person doesn't. That I'm starting to wonder if maybe these people's experience of consciousness is just so different to mine that they actually don't know what I'm talking about. When I talk about qualia and consciousness, maybe they just don't know what I'm banging on about. Maybe that's why we hit such an impasse with the argument. I'm not trying to be facetious here. I genuinely believe now that perhaps there are such big differences in different people's experience of consciousness that that's the source of a lot of the problems in argumentation. When I look at online discussions about consciousness, I find that this consideration passes across a lot of people's minds. They watch videos of Daniel Dennett seemingly failing to grasp certain fairly simple questions about qualia, and they ask themselves, is it possible that this guy actually just doesn't experience them? Is it possible that there aren't qualia in Dennett's brain, and that's why he seems unable to give a satisfactory answer? I went online and found that plenty of people have a similar experience, not just when listening to Dennett, but when reading online comments accusing qualia proponents of believing in magic or being pseudoscientists. There's something about the criticisms that doesn't just ring hollow, but seems to miss the point of what qualia proponents are saying. The temptation is strong to respond, I don't just disagree with you, but I suspect you don't know what I'm talking about. It's like trying to talk to someone about an elephant in an elephant enclosure, and the person's responding as if they can't see the elephant in the enclosure and also don't know what an elephant is, so they assume you're talking about one of the trees. I think this mental reaction at first feels wrong. It feels almost as if you're entertaining the idea that somebody isn't fully sentient or something like that. But I think we should dissect that feeling. Just because somebody isn't conscious in the same way as you doesn't mean they're not conscious at all. Consider how Galton must have felt when he started to question whether his scientist friends might really not be able to produce mental imagery. It's easy to imagine that he could have gone through a phase of thinking, wait, does that mean that they're just robot men or something? Before eventually realizing that their reality might just be different to his. I get a parallel bad reaction when I make videos about deep anthropological differences between cultures. I remarked in one video that the way some members of my family, including me, process death seemed perplexing or worrying to those around us, and how the inverse was true as well. Their expectations of how we should react to death seemed alarming and strange to me. When I put this in a video, I got responses saying that it was insulting or othering to suggest that some cultures don't experience certain common emotional reactions to death. But I wasn't talking about Native Americans or Japanese people, I was talking about myself. To comment that my talk was othering is to suggest that my own experience of life isn't part of the tapestry of human experience. I can't imagine anything more othering than that. Having differences in experience acknowledged and explored seems to be the right way to avoid being othering or insulting. So is it possible that there are people who don't have qualia as part of their experience, who are conscious in some way, but not in a qualia way? I think the answer is probably yes for a few reasons. One, many philosophers who are proponents of qualia agree that they seem to be pretty much functionless. The confusing thing about them is that the brain could work identically well if it didn't have them in. I don't know if I completely agree that they're functionless for a couple of reasons, but I'd invite you to compare it to the mental imagery or internal monologue things. I don't feel that I miss out on much by not having an internal monologue, even though it's a functional thing you could presumably see on a brain scan. I might not be consciously aware of much of what I'm thinking. I might not be consciously aware that I've run out of milk. But I didn't notice that until I was in my 20s, and it doesn't seem to affect my ability to do things. People's surprise about others having or lacking internal monologues just goes to show that these much more consequential differences in experience often go unnoticed and don't affect social interaction much at all unless people specifically start talking about their brains. If these functional differences can exist between human brains, surely something as apparently ineffectual as qualia could be different, more intense in some people, perhaps even absent in others. Also, I understand a lot of arguments about consciousness being an illusion when applied to certain aspects of my consciousness. I think of it as very roughly a three-tiered system, with the tier relating to how confusing the phenomenon is. Tier 1 is autonomic computations like the ones that control my heartbeat. I never feel even remotely conscious of this, even though it's going on in my brain and made of the same stuff as all my other brain activity. Tier 2 is things like abstract thoughts, decisions, and raw emotions. As I go about my daily activities, I feel like I'm consciously deciding to do things. I feel like I'm consciously deciding to move my arm to pick up a mug or to start doing some work. But if I introspect about it, the decision-making doesn't feel like anything. It feels like nothing at all. It has no qualities whatsoever, and in fact, to paraphrase Chomsky, I'm not conscious of the decision to pick up the mug until I feel and see my arms start moving. Likewise, I'm conscious of my physical reaction to an emotion and to the stimulus that caused it, but on introspection, the raw emotion itself feels like absolutely nothing and has no qualities whatsoever. It's not just that it's indescribable. I can tell you with confidence it has no presence in my conscious experience and doesn't feel like anything. The conscious experience of raw emotion, for me, doesn't exist on any level of reflection. I'm very happy to accept that my feeling that I'm conscious of these things is totally illusory, that my brain is actually just running the numbers and tricking me into thinking I'm conscious in the same way that it tricks me into thinking I have good peripheral vision. I have barely any issue with this at all. I'm with you on that one. There's no Cartesian theatre that these decisions and thoughts are happening in. My brain just has to feel that it's a cohesive entity, and so it tricks itself. Fine. Then above that, there's Tier 3, Qualia. These are pretty much exclusively related to sensory processing, and are the most concrete, real, and distinct things that I have ever known in my life. When I was growing up, I just assumed that they were properties of the world. Redness, blueness, loud noise, what biscuits taste like. I just assumed all these things were what was going on outside my head. The qualia representing a crow, that's just what a crow is. If I were able to jump outside my brain, the crow would still look the same, that's just what it looks like. It was only when I started thinking about consciousness that I realised this can't be true. My brain is generating a model of the world made of different stuff to the outside world. My brain's model is made of action potentials running through neural circuits, not the same stuff that's outside my head. So I thought, how could my brain be reconstructing the irreducibly complex properties of the world for me to see? Yes, it preserves the mathematical information about why that thing is red instead of green, what wavelengths it reflects, etc. But how does the actual redness get from the outside world into my brain? And then I realised, my experience of redness isn't an actual property of the object outside my head. It's just my brain's label for that wavelength, how my brain tells me that the thing is red. Wow, I thought, the most obvious, striking, basic thing about redness is just something that's inside my brain. The apple doesn't really look like that. The more I thought about this, the more it confused me. Wait, why does the brain make it look like that? That seems kind of arbitrary. And then eventually, how does the brain make it look like that? How would the brain even do that? How would it even make redness when all it can do is fire action potentials through neurons? Redness and brain activity seem to have nothing to do with each other. It doesn't even seem like the kind of thing that the brain should be able to do. The same goes for sound. The thing I've spent my whole life thinking of as loudness isn't what loudness actually is. It's just my brain's label for it. How does it make loudness and red feel so categorically different to each other, different from the ground up, sharing no characteristics at all, when they actually both just boil down to the same kinds of brain activity? If this chain resonates with you, if you understand my confusion, you probably have a similar experience of qualia to me. Qualia is the name philosophers give to these properties of our experience that seem to go beyond brain activity, what the loud sounds like, what the red looks like. But I'm more interested in if this didn't resonate with you, if you don't really get what I mean, if you're trying to understand what I'm talking about but it doesn't quite add up, or just doesn't seem like much of a mystery to you. I'd love to hear your perspective on this issue in the comments, and I'm not just saying that for engagement, I'm genuinely interested. When I talk to some people about this who are skeptical of the concept of qualia, I get the impression that they think qualia are something that only happens when I look really deep into myself and think a bit too hard. I start to see a flickery little ghost because of wishful thinking, Almost like if somebody started thinking too hard about the concept of a door, and they started to become convinced that alongside the physical structure of the door, there needed to be this extra magic conceptual barrier that stopped people getting through the door, and if you think hard enough about it, you'll see what I mean. And the obvious answer to that is, no man, there's just a door. The physics of the door explain everything about it, you don't need an extra thing. But that's not the kind of thing that we mean when we talk about qualia. It's a consuming, inescapable experience. Qualia make up everything that I see and hear. It's impossible for me to imagine seeing, hearing, or tasting without qualia, in the same way that somebody with an internal monologue might find it impossible to imagine thinking without one. It absolutely takes a bit of mind searching initially to recognise the qualia for what they are, but that's just because I've gone my whole life assuming that that's just what the outside world looks like. I'd never had to think about it before. I wonder if some people experience qualia the same way that I experience Tier 2 conscious experiences. That they know when something's red or green, but if they try to introspect on that experience, it doesn't really feel like anything. And so, from their perspective, coming up with a name for it and treating it as a scientific entity seems kind of ridiculous. Obviously, it's just an illusion, in the same way that I find it obvious that my decision-making is just an illusion. If that resonates with you, again, I would love to hear about it. I don't think that what I'm saying here explains the hard problem of consciousness at all, but I think if true, it would be an interesting thing to study, and it would certainly shed light on certain aspects of the debate if it turns out that a lot of the people debating don't know what the other people are talking about. It would be fascinating to know why there are these large differences between people, why some people find qualia to be an insoluble problem as I do, but some people don't seem to consider this a problem at all. The most frustrating thing about this topic is that I know that I can't convey how obvious qualia are to a hypothetical person who doesn't have them. It's such a hard concept to wrap your head around. All of us qualia proponents insist that qualia are irreducible, can't be broken down into components, can't be an emergent property of quantitative information. If I see a red screen, the red isn't made of anything. It doesn't seem to break down into any components of red, it's just red. But I can easily imagine someone asking, but how the hell would you know that? What makes you so convinced that these things are irreducible? When you look at a crow, it doesn't seem like it can be reduced to a bundle of mathematical properties, but any scientifically minded person knows that it can. What makes qualia any different? For a long time I struggled to answer this question. It's a fair point. Why am I so convinced that the experience of redness can't be broken down into smaller components? Thinking about the question didn't make it go away at all, but it is a fair question. And then I realised that qualia are still totally baked into the way that I think about everything. Growing up, learning about science and maths, I always had this sense that qualia, I didn't know the word then of course, but I still experienced them, that qualia were the sort of real, coarse properties of the world around me, and that when physicists described the mathematical properties of things, that was just a nice model for explaining some of the very basic things about the qualia. The qualia themselves were rich, complex reality, and the maths was just a neat way of explaining a small percentage of the things about the qualia. It was always obvious to me, even as a teenager I think, that you can't describe everything about the world using maths, but it hits a wall eventually, because as finely as you can describe the difference between 650 nanometers wavelength light and 500 nanometers wavelength light, it's never going to explain why one of them looks red and the other looks green. The red-green thing is intrinsically qualitative, not quantitative. There's no way that a pure quality can come from a bundle of mathematical properties. This was always obvious to me as long as I thought about maths or science. In that sense, although I didn't recognise it at the time, my thinking was fundamentally dualistic, but I just thought that was normal. When people talked about dualism, I thought of it as the idea that there's an earthly realm and then a magic other realm like heaven or something, which seemed ridiculous to me because I had no experience indicating that heaven or some other realm existed. I didn't think of dualism as being the idea that qualities are not the same thing as the mathematical properties that underlie them. I just thought that that was obvious. It's only while making this video that I've come to completely realise that when you strip the qualia away from human experience, everything else is just bundles of mathematically describable physics as far as we know. The world is just a mass of information with no flavours or colours or sounds, just the physical stuff that underlies flavours and colours and sounds. If somebody's hypothetically never experienced qualia, if they've only experienced vision and hearing the way I experience decision-making as something that maybe kind of feels conscious but disappears on closer reflection, they're not going to have any idea what a quality is, other than as an emergent property of something that can be completely described mathematically. The difference in thinking would be so fundamental that a constructive conversation about the hard problem of consciousness would be completely impossible. And this is what we see in many such conversations. Two people talking about completely different things, neither of them realizing that there's an axiomatic difference between their positions. Thinking about it from this angle has led me, I think, to better understand some of the people who criticize the idea of qualia. When I was a teenager, I, like many of us, went through an edgy atheist phase where I'd watch all of the Richard Dawkins debates and all that kind of stuff. I'm still not religious now, but I suppose my beliefs or my conviction is a bit less strong. I realise that I'm just a human and I could be wrong about all of these things, so I don't go and watch all of those things the same way that I used to. But when I was about 15 or so, I went through an edgy atheist phase, and one of the arguments that I heard in these debates and also from close friends who were devout Christians was that there's a kind of experiential way in which we all know that God exists. God reveals himself to everyone, and it's up to the person to sort of let God in. So when we were talking about creation, there'd be arguments like, well, just look around you, look at the stars at night, how on earth can that not be evidence of God? Look at the trees and the grass, how on earth can you say these things aren't evidence of God? The evidence is everywhere. And these things would fail to convince me because I just couldn't see what they meant. I don't see the stars as evidence of God. I don't see a tree as evidence of God. I'm not trying to be facetious. I just genuinely don't see it that way. And similar kind of arguments would factor into things like moral intuition. How would you have a moral intuition? It's so intuitively obvious that comes from some divine creator. It's so clear. And I got the sense that from these people's perspective, the existence of God was so intuitively obvious in all aspects of life that the only explanation for why somebody could be an atheist is if they were actively trying to suppress their intrinsic knowledge that God existed. They were actively pushing down their understanding that there was a God, or they were trying to rationalize it, trying to explain it as something else, perhaps because they were scared of being judged, or they didn't want someone to be in charge of them, or something like that. But that intrinsically, if they just let go, if they just let themselves be taken by it, they would be filled up with this belief. I may be misunderstanding or mischaracterizing those views, but that was the impression I got. And thinking about qualia, which is not the same thing as religion at all, I'm not about to say that qualia is evidence of God or anything like that. But thinking about the idea of someone who lacks qualia, I can kind of understand where these Christians were coming from, I feel. To me, obviously qualia are there in my experience, and presumably they're there in everyone else's experience as well. So the idea of someone actually not being able to grasp them or denying their existence, to me, just seems insane. You don't have to have scientific evidence for it. It's right there. It's just there. It's intuitive. It's the most obvious thing in the world. And I imagine that one of these Christians I talked about might have the same perspective on God and the same perspective on divinity. You don't have to have mathematical, quantitative evidence for it. It's just obvious in everything you look at that God is real. And so, to clarify again, I'm in between these two. I believe that there are qualia in my experience, but I don't believe in God. So I understand the perspective of those who can't understand the qualia thing, because I think it's probably similar to my perspective on very religious people who believe that God is everywhere. I respect the experience of those religious people who believe that God is everywhere, and I understand that I'll never fully grasp what it's like for them to look at a tree and see God. That's not an experience I think I'm capable of. And likewise, I have to accept that people who deny the existence of qualia, perhaps because they haven't experienced them in the same way, there's nothing I can say that will convince them because I can't prove it, you know. And this is, I suppose, a humbling realization, because it puts me in the position of some people who I was quite frustrated with about 10 or 15 years ago. It puts me in the position of the guy who's trying to demonstrate the existence of something which seems intrinsically unprovable to somebody who doesn't know what I'm talking about.